Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the November 16th weekly JupyterLab call. Today is a bit of a lighter week. We have 16 people on the call. If you haven't already, please sign into the agenda. There's links to it in the chat. And I don't have any announcements to make up top. We'll keep some minutes free at the end in case you want to make announcements off of the recorded call. And we'll keep a section for additional discussion if there's anything you want to talk about that's going to take more than, say, 5 minutes. But since the agenda looks really light, maybe that won't be an issue today. And with that said, why don't we get started? The first person on the agenda today is Eric Gentry.
Yeah, so Anaconda is trying to improve the JupyterLab extension developer docs, and we just have a mind toward making that experience and the process better and as easy as possible for people. I'm running through the JupyterLab extension tutorial right now, and I'm getting some errors, which I had brought up on Gitter, I got a couple of responses, but if anybody else has any suggestions with this issue I'm facing, I would appreciate that. It will help speed me through this part of it, I hope, so that I can move on to more productive efforts toward improving the docs.
Have you opened an issue in either, I guess, the cookie cutter maybe where you started, or in lab if it's specifically a lab issue? Because Gitter is very transient, and whoever sees it and answers you is kind of luck of the draw, and then you sort of scroll past people's awareness and it may get lost.
I can, yeah, I can submit an issue for this. So I guess I would be, where would I submit that issue to? I'm not sure where the read the docs content is actually hosted. Is that just in the JupyterLab repo?
Oh yeah, that's right. It's in the JupyterLab repo. Yeah, the only other place where I might imagine an issue arising is if there's something that belonged in the cookie cutter and wasn't there. You could open an issue in the cookie cutter, but
okay,
really just open it in JupyterLab, because if that's the wrong place for it, it'll get triaged and we'll recommend where to put it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And Jeremy says in the chat, an issue on the lab repo would be great if it's related to the tutorial. So yeah, that makes sense.
Cool, thanks.
Great, thank you for working on this, Eric, because I think it'll have a big impact on people who are writing extensions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. The next person on the agenda is Isabella.
Hello. Yep, I know what I'm doing, I promise. What I was hoping to discuss today, I know a few weeks in the past, I've brought up some JupyterLab reflow proposals, meaning right when we zoom in, what happens? How does the content stay all on the screen? I can link to the issue and comment again in here, though it is in the agenda, just so it's not totally weird what I'm talking about. But I kind of wanted to bring it up again because I've heard some feedback, but not enough, I think, for like the scale of the change that this would be to JupyterLab, because it's a pretty big change. So kind of opening up for further discussion here, though I think we have more on the agenda, so we may need to throw it to the additional discussion section some. But also I'm kind of thinking this needs to be a vote. I know we try and avoid doing the JupyterLab council votes if we can come to other consensus, but this seems like a really big change to me. So I'm also throwing that out there. Any of you can disagree with that, but that's kind of my update, just trying to keep that moving forward. So I will stop for comments. Immediate panic, immediate excitement. I don't know. We kind of have 3 options right now.
Well, what do you think? So is there a way to introduce people to the options on this call, or do you think it's too detailed to try to describe the options you're proposing?
Oh, I can do that. It was more, I just trying to be respectful of the agenda, and I could see that taking more than 5 minutes, but yeah, I can do that.
Well, I propose this then. How about you try to present what the options are now, and then if we have time for additional discussion, that's when people can weigh in after having thought through what you say now.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, I can do that real quick. So right now, based on the little bit discussion we have, we actually have 3 options. I was going to update this issue regardless, because Mike had some really good thoughts on some other behavior I hadn't considered yet. So the first option is kind of what happens now, in the sense that when you zoom in any way, it reflows by prioritizing like the UI around the document in JupyterLab. So right, the panels just take up the space, the kind of document space gets smaller, the menu gets larger. And we can continue doing that, and just we have to make certain fixes, because right now when that happens, we're still losing things on the way it scales. But so that's like the first thing, is kind of the current behavior, but a little more polished. The second approach would be to say, hey, actually the document is the most important thing to us in JupyterLab. So when we start zooming in, we start collapsing some of the UI. There's more specifics on that in the issue, but like there's varied proposals. We do currently have the sidebars collapse, but even the sidebar, like the width of the with a sidebar gets really large. And then when you expand it, it usually takes up most of the screen after a certain zoom point. So that would be the other, to say, hey, we start collapsing some of the UI, start throwing more things in the command palette, make the command palette more available on the home screen instead of just being hidden in a menu. And the third option, that's based on feedback from Mike, is the document is the priority, but the idea that zoom behavior kind of only acts on the document. And then if you want to have larger UI, that's like preferences, like that's a setting that you choose, rather than that might be kind of reminiscent of, I don't know, I'm thinking like, I think that's kind of what Microsoft Word does. If you zoom in, right, the document gets bigger before the UI. So that's my summary of the 3. Thanks.
Cool. All right, folks, how about we go through the agenda, but return to this. So please have this in the back of your minds. But for now, we'll move on to William.
I just have a quick remark that like 3 days ago, one of the users of CoCalc, where we also have like plain vanilla JupyterLab running with the potential of being collaborative, had like a list of reproducible steps, which led to something that felt a lot like we all experienced last week when we were testing real-time collaboration, where they could make changes, but they couldn't actually save them to disk. So if anybody's looking into this problem, they might find these steps of value to try out. But it's basically, for them, it was what triggered it was very different. It was having the notebook server stop and then get restarted. But the experience they had on their side was very similar to what we experienced. So there might be some relationship involving initializing the state between the back end and the front end. So I just wanted to toss that out there.
Thanks for this recipe. This is helpful. David, who is on the call, has been working on this, and I wonder if this is in line with the changes you've been making.
I don't know, which version was it?
You'll have to give me a second to tell you. I can't
Is it an
remember.
alpha 3.6 or an alpha 4.0?
It's going to take me however long it takes to start it up to tell you, unfortunately.
Yeah, but anyway, we are really working hard right now on it, and there are really probably some issues in the previous releases, alpha releases, so I'm not really surprised. but it should be fixed soon.
Woohoo! Version 3.50.
Oh,
Good.
not even an alpha. Yeah, then that's a really kind of old already.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. It's too old to say what was wrong. There was a couple of issues in the past. So yeah, I can't really help here.
Okay, thanks for what you're doing.
William, for your purposes, if you want a 3.x line and you want to have a test that's closer to the one we did last week, the next 3.6 release, whether it's an alpha or a beta,
Mhm.
will have basically the latest attempts to fix these kinds of issues. So when that comes out, that's the one I think you might target and test next.
Okay, cool.
Cool. Thank you for reporting back, though. This is helpful. All right. Cool. Well, does anyone have anything they would like to add to the regular agenda? If not, we have one discussion item added, and we also have Isabella's item that she just talked about, but I'll give you a chance in case there's something you've been holding back on. Don't be shy.
Yes, Tony is right in the chat. I got caught up posting community.
I've got
calls.
a quick question to a proposal. So we've been migrating some of the repos to use releaser from the repository, including a couple that use npm. So Jupyter Scheduler has an npm package, and Jupyter Resource Usage. Wondering if we want to do that for Lumino and JupyterLab. Given that we had positive experience on the other ones, and I mean, so the security risk there is that we're using shared credentials, and the credentials would be on the repository, but the mitigation is the fact that whoever's running the commit or the workflow, we validate that they're an admin on that particular repo, so Lumino or JupyterLab. So I can propose this on the Team Compass if that makes sense to do that, or if it's kind of a non-issue at this point, we can just go ahead and do it.
Who will be the user who publishes to, say, npm or IPI?
So that is the JupyterLab bot account for each of those. So it uses scoped PyPI token because those exist for Lab and Lumino. Sorry, Lumino doesn't even have a Jupyter a PyPI package. For the npm side, there's no such thing as a scope token, so it's just a pure release token. And that JupyterLab bot only has release capability. It doesn't have admin access to the npm side. So what you'd see, at least on PyPI for JupyterLab, on the security tab, if you're an owner, is a release event from the JupyterLab bot account. And then if you go to look at the commit history, the commit is whoever triggered it, their generic, it'll be their handle and their generic GitHub. I forget what it is. So if your email is private, it's the one that will work and associate with your avatar. So it'll show up as whoever released it in the commit history, just not with your private email address. Let's see what Jason said there.
Jason asks, so if I'm an admin on one repo, what does that mean I can do on other repos?
So it's actually validating that you're an admin on the target repo. So you can't, I mean, if you're using Jupyter Releaser from your fork, then that's a different story. Actually, no, it still is doing the validation. So even if you're doing Releaser from a fork of Releaser with your own tokens, it's still validating that you're an admin on that repository.
So the releaser itself is doing the validation then?
Yes, it's part of the steps that run.
What if that validation didn't exist? Would it just error and fail because you don't have the rights, or would it?
So yeah, if it can't read the user thing, it means that the bot account's not set up right. And if it reads that you're not an admin, it'll error out and say, I'm not going to allow this.
From a security perspective, is there a case, like a bad case, where it doesn't notice that you don't have admin rights and it still lets you push to a repo you're not supposed to?
That would be a GitHub API giving the wrong answer back.
Okay, so
because it's actually calling a REST endpoint and API GitHub to get your user status.
okay, so it's dependent on other APIs that are doing the security part of this then.
Yes, yeah, it's deferring to GitHub for that.
Okay,
And there's a one of the event parameters is a GitHub. I forget what it's called, but it's the person who actually triggered the workflow. So if you re-triggered someone else's workflow, it would show up as your credentials, and check that user to be an admin.
Steve, let me rephrase my question. You mentioned that there was a risk from shared credentials. What are the ramifications of that risk?
So the more people that had access to shared credentials, like the actual credentials to log in with those bot accounts are in our 1Password account, which limits the pool in that sense. I mean, we do have an audit trail for, we don't get alerts if someone publishes the PyPI per se. But if someone else got the bot account credentials, but they all have two-factor authorization on them, and they'd be protected by GitHub secrets, which by default will not print even if you print them to the console. They get detected and obfuscated. So I haven't seen a threat angle, but yeah, if someone notices one, I'd be happy to know that so we can adjust. But we've been like trying to find all the holes that we might be exposing here over time.
So
I don't know if there are any left.
The threat isn't a lot of people having access to the credentials. It's the fact that the bot has all the credentials, and whoever has access to that bot could technically go in there and leverage the bot. That's
yes, but on the PyPI side, an admin could actually, no, you couldn't even. You'd have to be a pretty rogue admin on the account to get access to the bot's token, and even that is only it's the scope token for that to release on that one package. But I'm not. If someone has right access, they might be able to somehow leak those to themselves, but I don't know how they would do that. I guess maybe if I don't want to talk too much
the security of every
recorded call.
Yeah, it sounds like the security of any individual contributor is about the same as the security of this bot. So that's
yeah. So I guess the question is whether someone with right access and not admin access could access the bot credentials, and then make rogue releases. Is I think what you're getting at, Alex.
Just Steve, is the credential not redacted by GitHub automatically, like in the log?
It is.
Someone, yeah.
Yeah.
So
You'd have to get more clever to extract that for your nefarious purposes.
Yeah, you'd have to find a way to log in as the bot. It really, and that's just account authentication at that point.
Yeah, it has two-factor auth on all these accounts: PyPI, GitHub, npm, etc. The email accounts.
So to summarize, a bot admin could potentially publish any package that the bot has access to, even if that person, that bot admin, is not an admin on the package repo. Is that a summary of potentially presumably?
Yeah, if you got access to the GitHub bot or the PyPI token, the scope token, then you could basically impersonate that bot. But that's the same of any scoped PyPI token.
Yep.
To answer your question, Piyush, we do grant this bot access to push because it's actually pushing the commit and tags for the release.
So presumably a bot admin could also push commits, not just publish packages.
Yes.
Okay.
You'd need the bot's GitHub admin access token, which is another secret on the account. And right now, so there's a new beta thing for scoped access tokens, personal access tokens. That I opened an issue on Releaser to look into that. Ideally, those would also be scoped to that particular repo, so that the bot would only have access with that token to that repo. But right now, it's whatever the bot has access to. And there's one bot per GitHub org right now. So IPython, JupyterLab, Jupyter Server, and Jupyter each have their own set of bot stuff right now.
Do you want to continue that, having a bot per subproject?
It seems like a good balance because I'm using expiring tokens.
Yeah.
I guess it wouldn't matter. You'd still have to replace all the tokens on a 90-day interval, or whatever you choose to do as the admin. But yeah, anything we can do to scope it down, like on the NPM side, the fact that you can't have scope tokens, I think it's good to minimize the reach as far as you can.
Are you looking for a consensus on whether to do this, or?
I was reading the room basically. I can open a Team Compass issue on the topic.
Does anyone?
Question
Yeah.
not about security. So this would be replacing our current release process.
It's an alternate way to do it. Yeah.
Okay, that was going to be my question. Is will the other release things still work? Would we still be able to use
absolutely.
Releaser 1.x or do a manual release? Of course, we could always do a manual release, but would Releaser 1 still work if you did it on a fork?
Yeah, and that's actually what Jeremy and Fred had to do for a little while is make releases from the previous branch and tag of Releaser on 1.x before JupyterLab main and 3.6 or whatever supported Releaser v2 workflows.
Okay, so the classic way of doing releases is still available.
Well, even Releaser v2 allows you to release from your fork still. So that's still going to be there. So yeah, it basically would open both options to JupyterLab. So you can either run it from your fork or run it from JupyterLab itself.
Okay, so running it from your fork is still possible, and this is just making it so you don't have to fork it if you don't want to.
Yeah, you don't have to fork, set up your credentials, and maintain those separately. It'd be centralize that.
Got it. Cool.
Okay. Is there a question you want to ask for people to thumbs up or thumbs down or anything like that, or do you want to just open a Team Compass?
I'll just open the Team Compass. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. All right. Anyone else?
Hi. I just wanted to ask a question, if that was.
Sure. Hi. Welcome.
Okay, yeah. Hi. Yeah. So yeah, my name's Steve. I'm working on a package called Phoebe, which is sort of a downstream package that uses, I'd say, fragments of or parts of the JupyterLab code base. And for example, it'll use JupyterLab Service Manager and JupyterLab Output Area, and in order to sort of render outputs from Jupyter notebooks in isolation, and it's aimed at doing that in very different web contexts. And the work I've been doing recently has been to sort of try and take that from working in a plain HTML page through to also working inside more modern frameworks like React, Remix, Next.js, etc. And I guess two things was I guess I've encountered some situations and been working around situations where some of the internal classes are problematic to use in those contexts. And there are maybe changes that could be made to make that easier to consume them. And so my question was sort of in two ways is, does JupyterLab have any sort of downstream dependencies at the moment that the sort of team considers that isn't the whole application? So something a little bit like the TD use case. And also aside of that, what's the best way to start, I guess, raising issues like this and starting some discussion on whether some changes could be made or whether like a downstream thing like DB could be supported?
I could say things, but there are 20 other people on the call.
Yeah.
Who would like to start responding?
So for a simple case using the part of JupyterLab, it's in JupyterLab itself. I think it's the best sources. We have an example folder that has some remixed of the various pieces of the code for doing simpler application. So because basically most of the code is in JupyterLab itself, the major dependency that we get is the Lumino library that we are also maintaining, but it's more about the interface and some features like this signal thing that we can use for exchanging information between various pieces of the software. Regarding improving reusability, the best is to open issue directly on the GitHub JupyterLab repository, and we will gladly improve that part. I'm pretty sure like there are things like that are private and could be moved to protected and stuff like that for easier re-implementation. And so yeah, it's always more it's always useful to have people like you that want to reuse things to figure out a better API. So we'll happily discuss what are your issues and try to improve the code from that.
So yeah, you're pointing out the examples is a really good place. The other thing is that the two libraries you specifically mentioned, services and output area, are quite different. So services, because it has no UI component, is a fairly straightforward one to fold into your application, and even apps very different from JupyterLab, like VS Code, use the services package. Things that are UI, like output area, there are multiple paradigms for building UIs that Jupyter applications use and support. We have some components that are React components. We have some components that are the widgets of the Lumino library that underlies JupyterLab. And we have some components that are composites, because they might bring in a React bit and they might wrap that in a Lumino widget and then consume it that way. So hopefully there are examples that are analogous to what you want to do for using something like React plus Remix. The life cycle of JupyterLab components that are widgets is slightly different than the life cycle of a React component, but it can be made to sort of play nice, basically. But yeah, if it turns out that either there's no example that gives you a usable enough starting point, or if it's the case that just the API of output area or some other widget that you're using is insufficient to your needs, yeah, please open up issues in the main JupyterLab repo. The reason there's so many packages in there is specifically for modularity and composability. So if there's a way to make it better, we'd love to. Anyone else have any feedback for Steve or suggestions? All right, cool.
Okay, thanks. I will go ahead and open some issues. I think that I hadn't looked in depth in the examples folder, so thanks for pointing me there. And I guess there's a sort of spectrum of different like things or changes from ranging from like the structure of the imports, I guess, through to questions like should I be using the sort of Jupyter front end plugin system as a way to then go and integrate. So but I'll go ahead and open issues with those specific questions then.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Shall we revisit Isabella's reflow proposal about zooming in JupyterLab?
Sure.
I actually had a follow-up question on that, Isabella. So the different proposals sounded interesting, but I was having trouble figuring out what the use case for this zoom was.
Yeah.
I felt like depending on the use case, option 1 and option 2 each were better. Like, is this like a zoom because I'm in a small screen, or is this a zoom because I can't see? I'm like partially blind.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the difficult thing with it is, well, I have motivations and that I'm coming to this for an accessibility perspective. So I am kind of I'm leaning more towards some of that low vision support, although I would not say that like mobile is not an accessibility accommodation. But at the same time, I don't know if we can decide based on one of those axes. I don't think we can, in fact, people use this for a lot of different things. So yes, I would like those to be included. That was kind of my motivation, is specifically there is a WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, a standard that discusses kind of expected reflow behavior. I can link that in the chat if you want. I think it's in the issue. And so my motivation is I'm trying to get us to meet more of those standards. And that would include having this reflow, which the criteria is kind of like all the content needs to be on the page without horizontal scroll bars unless you're under a certain size. And on the page, meaning like you can have a vertical scroll. It's just trying to not like have it kind of overflowing in the window. So just like trying to be honest, that's my motivation. But at the same time, I think one of the times I brought this up, it was like, oh, I want this, more for presentations, that I want to make sure I know what's zooming there. Or like you said, on a small screen, I might want something different. So I don't know if that really answered your question, because I just said there's a lot of motivation.
Yeah, I think it partially does. In that case, it feels like the toolbars need to be zoomed in too, because there's cases where you need to be able to see the toolbars because they're too small. So I feel like we need to let the toolbars zoom in too. And then it's a question of how do we handle when you zoom in too far? Because I think of I think of a lot of websites where like if you zoom in far enough, it hides menus. Or it makes it so for instance, if you'd hide the sidebars entirely, and if you wanted to open them, they'd replace the whole screen. But that's a very, I lost the web term all of a sudden, modular. Yeah, I lost the web term. A way of going about it, like it's a very mobile centric way of going about it. And we have, as far as I know, done almost none of that type of development inside of JupyterLab right now.
I think there was some effort. I don't know too much about it. I might be calling people. I feel like Jeremy actually did some work on mobile stuff at one point, but correct me if I'm wrong. So I know there has been something. I'm not totally sure what the current state is.
There we go. Gabriel put in the chat, responsive development.
Yeah, so there's very slow moving progress towards some sort of tablet and mobile support. Recently, we switched most, but not all, with the notable exception of DataGrid. Most Lumino packages now listen to pointer events instead of mouse-specific events. The initial motivation for the what I can't remember whether we call it mode or format attribute of the Jupyter frontend was to have things like desktop, mobile, tablet, but that's not how it panned out. But we did put in for a while some media queries to that end as well. But really, we haven't had a coherent and targeted effort to support non-desktop browsers yet. I think Notebook 7 is a good place to start an effort like that because it's built with JupyterLab components and because it's got such a smaller surface area from an end user perspective. There's fewer user journeys to cover, so it seems like an easier target to make mobile friendly. But yeah, there isn't really more than that.
Yeah,
most of the
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on this, like most of the recent efforts were just to, try to remove some things that were not necessarily useful on mobile. So Notebook 7 is really, it's really just a notebook on the page. So on mobile, it's working pretty nicely. With Lab, you still have like this side panels that kind of are in the way. But for now, it's only mostly been just adjusting some CSS so that the prompts, for example, are aligned vertically instead of horizontally, these kind of things. So yeah, but it's just like small things and iterations that mostly.
So I think Alex's intuition about whether the toolbars ought to be hidden away and the notebook, or sorry, the document becomes a focus or not, I think that's probably right. I think at least if there were only one way we were doing it, if there weren't like multiple ways of handling Zoom for different kinds of users, then the one sort of lowest common denominator use case is we make the toolbar expand and the document expand so that the things that you want to do when you have this thing open are the things that are available to you in this zoomed in state. But that's not a very well thought out position.
Well, and I'd like to note they're not mutually exclusive. Like right now, I believe that there is a setting that allows you to change. It's basically allowing you to change the value of the UI font variable, right? Like that CSS variable. I have to say, I'm not sure if it's working. I haven't posted an issue because I haven't been able to test it to see if it's like something on my end that's making it act wrong, but I actually can't get it to respond right now. But that's something I would say too, is we do already have a feature nominally that should make your UI, like you be able to enlarge the UI font. It's just that you can overflow the button size. You can actually like cut your text off within a button or a menu sometimes. So that's not quite there either. But yeah, like I could see both, because that's part of what I'm thinking too, since you're asking, Alex, like since we do need to be, or I want to be centering, I should say, low vision use cases, regardless of what screen it is. Yes, you may need the UI to also be larger, but also it can take up a lot of real estate and then you can't get to the document very easily. So it's kind of like, should those be, that's where I kind of agree with what Mike said, is should those kind of be separate operations depending what you need. But
so,
yeah.
Follow up, because I just was staring at the other case, because I was thinking responsive design definitely feels like something we should support and it would naturally address the zoom. But the idea of just zooming in the main area we could just do that as a feature. We could put like a plus minus zoom in the menu at the top with like and it just zooms in on the main area, like as a separate feature.
William, are you raising your hand?
I just want a huge +1 Alex's suggestion from like in CoCalc and every single editor I have in terminals, I make it super, super easy for every single panel to individually zoom it in or out. And when my eyes start getting tired looking at something, I find it incredibly useful to just be able to zoom in one particular piece of text. And then sometimes you even just want to really, really easily zoom in and out things just to highlight them or focus on them when you're working. So just it's very, very nice having that kind of feature.
You know, like a main area zoom built into JupyterLab. So like not as part of like the web page of Jupyter, but the actual JupyterLab instance, it zooms in specifically on the main area widget.
Yeah, I'm looking because I thought that was there somewhere, but you're right. I'm not seeing it anywhere. I just opened JupyterLab.
One of those features that's in so many applications, you forget it's not like default in all applications.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I will say though, at least for me in Firefox, is that I agree we should have something separate of what the browser allows too, but my like browser zoom does allow me to zoom in on just the document at the moment if I choose to. But yeah, we should probably have that. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to think like in sense of, I'm trying to keep this moving forward.
So that would be like, in my head, that would be like two features. One is JupyterLab Zoom, where JupyterLab's menu lets you zoom in on the main area. And then two would be adding responsive design. So if they zoom in, for instance, using the web browser zoom, that would make the whole page bigger, like including the bars, and then potentially hide them when you zoom in too far, like in a mobile-esque methodology. So they'd be two different menus. The zoom in, like for instance, in Safari or Chrome versus the zoom in JupyterLab's menu.
Yeah.
Now I'm telling you to do two features.
I don't take particular issue with that personally, but I'm trying to aim for a useful experience. Okay, with this, I guess what I'm thinking with this is I feel like and there may need to be more discussion about behavior, but I'm not sure like how we agree in this case because, right, so I think what you're saying makes sense. I don't know if anyone else thinks these things, and I know it would impact a lot of JupyterLab, like say I magically had this change for you tomorrow, right? And it was in a PR. Like how do we know that that is the right approach? Is that going to mess with anything? Can people see places where this might break? That sort of thing might be helpful in decision making.
So this seems like the kind of thing where it's way more upside than downside, because right now, if you zoom in, your experience is broken. And lots of people presumably are not zooming in, so are not complaining about the broken Zoom experience. And the ones who are experiencing it will have at least a thought out thing they see as a basis of this PR. And if it turns out that it's thought out, but it's not covering all the use cases, then issues that come in might be more relevant and able to like give us something to iterate on. So I don't know that we have to know we've picked the best solution as long as it's an improvement on the current usability, right?
I
would agree. I'm just thinking in terms of like, right, I won't be the one doing this development, but I'm trying to think in terms of like before time is spent there, how do we know that we're doing something that is agreed on with the community in this case, since we do have a few options that behave differently, right? Like I could see someone reviewing a PR for what we said and saying, that doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't it just clean up the existing behavior of JupyterLab? And so that's kind of why I'm trying to like raise the issue around and make sure we're gathering everything instead of just, I don't want to come across like pushing for a really aggressive change.
Sure.
I think we're talking about interesting solutions. I'm not sure if we're talking about accessible solutions, especially with what Gabriel said about the specific WCAG condition. Right now, we need to be able to access all the content. That's the major thing that's missing. But reflow is what the goal would be.
Yeah, and if that's the goal, I feel like the only solution would be like a full responsive design, and that's a large project. Because
And that's what we're talking about. Yeah. So that's like, what way do we want it to respond though? Does responsive mean that everything stays on the screen and the UI like kind of like the document gets smaller to allow for the UI? Does the document push UI elements away?
So getting opinions on what responsive would look like. I can share in my head what I would imagine a responsive design would be, which is it zooms in the whole thing, and after a certain point, the sidebars get hidden, and there's some sort of like sandwich logo or something on the side that allows you to reopen one or the other. And when it's open, you can only see it. You can't see the main area. And similarly, tabs at the top, you might be able to scroll away the tabs at the top. The status bar at the bottom may or may not stay there, but sidebars, I think of it just like if you open up a mobile web page and there's normally a sidebar that's there all the time, but it eventually gets hidden if you open it on mobile with like a sandwich button. I wouldn't necessarily be able to speak to an actual UX for how we'd want to hide it and show it again and how that would come out. But I feel like that hidden with like a button to show it again for the sidebar specifically would be the most common responsive design.
Yeah, that's definitely one pattern I've been seeing and that we could work with. I want to check though, does anyone else have kind of expectations for this?
Some of the presentation tools feel like more interesting user experiences to think about. Like I like when I'm using JupyterLite now, I use Jupyter Deck, and I work in that mode on mobile. But some of kind of the pared down experiences hint at something I'd like in that space.
Yeah, and Jupyter Deck does cell by cell, right? Like cell by cell view essentially. Yeah, that's pretty
and you get
drastic
access
too.
And you get access to the command palette and stuff like that. It helps.
Yeah, and okay, no, I'm gonna read what you said, William.
I just double checked with Word, and I see Word is just literally zooming the whole document with no reflow. But I think, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was thumbs upping your suggestion, I meant that it would reflow the text. Like when you zoom in, it really just increases the font size and text flows around, like the markdown would get reflowed.
That is what I was thinking.
Yeah,
I did not know
Which oh no, sorry, go on.
That's all, just very different than what Word does.
Yeah, and some of that is
preserve it, and yeah.
There's some mess with that too that I don't have an immediate solution because I'm trying to figure out what direction, but I will also say, because I've seen this with testing some other things, reflowing code is kind of funky. There's some options we can work with, but so that's probably something we'll have to get to, but there are options for that.
I feel like the better thing to compare it to would be VS Code rather than Word.
Yeah, but they have a lot of different behaviors in there. Like the reason I'm not is because they have a very robust set of Zoom settings, and I don't think we can do all of that at once.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're right.
I don't use VS Code, so I wouldn't know. I use the WebStorm and PyCharm suite.
So I know this is a JupyterLab question, but I think maybe a model to look at is what Google Docs does, and to apply that to Jupyter Notebook. Then some of those things are going to end up in the notebook package itself, and we'll see what that translates to in lab. but it's a much harder problem to solve this problem in lab than it is in notebook. And the pieces of it that land in notebook are going to percolate up to lab anyway. So as just a systematic sort of smaller problem to larger problem approach, that might be something.
Okay, I will say Google Docs actually does a pretty bad job in this, in my informal opinion.
Mine
Because that
too.
was one I looked at. It really handles it like some of the worst, which surprised me sincerely. They usually handle these things a little better, and I was like, oh, this is kind of not thorough.
I think Word and Google Docs also suffer from the fact that like they are designed in many cases to print things on paper, which is a fixed size. And so zooming effectively means you're zooming into a portion of a piece of paper as opposed to a code editor, which is generally not used for that purpose.
Yeah, well, I think any single document interface app that's been around for a long time will probably be instructive here. So if it's not Google Docs, maybe it's Excel or something like that. But that is surprising to learn that Google Docs is not doing so great at it.
I mean, it does something that works technically. I don't want to say that they're not doing something that doesn't meet those requirements. It's just a little messy. But I also well, that may be a larger thing for this timeline. I guess in trying to figure out what are helpful next steps. Do I need to keep bringing this up as discussion? My concern also with just having it here is I know that there are people outside of the JupyterLab call that may want to weigh in on this. And though the issue exists, I don't think it's getting around to those people potentially. So I don't know. That's part of why I was looking at the voting stuff as well. But I don't know if there's another path forward or something that you all would prefer me to do.
I think if you have an intuition on what proposal is apt, and you change the issue to be a proposal for that, and target a milestone, come to the next lab call and say, okay, this issue is an issue we'd like to release this way. I'm looking for volunteers to work on it. It's for this milestone, and here's the thing we're proposing. All of a sudden, people who hadn't been talking might say stuff, or they might just be like, cool, let's do it.
I don't think this is just to be clear, I don't think this is a 4.0 thing with the time.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I was like, when you said milestone, I was like, this can't happen that fast.
No, it's probably like best case we get lucky and it's a 4.1. But
yeah. Okay, just checking when you said that. I was like, this is not at that point. Yeah.
Or if we piecemeal it, the first phase might sneak into 4.0.
I mean, there are a lot of fixes. No matter what direction we do, there are a lot of fixes that need to be done. I can tell you that. That's part of why I'm trying to get the direction, though, because the fixes will need to be done differently depending on how all these big pieces interact with one another.
Yeah, in the case of my pitch for just doing a full responsive design, each part of that would still, each piece of the design would still need to have the ability to reflow within it. So it's very much dependent on fixing it in like Notebook, fixing it in the code editor, fixing it in the other places as well, or first.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now just in case anyone wanted to say anything. Brace yourselves.